Throughout history, there are countless examples of places or objects said to bring suffering to those connected with them, earning a reputation for being cursed. In earlier episodes, we have explored several of these stories, from infamously unlucky motor vehicles to the final resting place of a convicted murderer. In this episode, we turn our attention to the preserved remains of an Ice Age hunter, a body some believe is linked to a series of unexplained deaths. Together, these events have come to be known as the Iceman's Curse. As he sat at his desk scanning through the brief his editor had just forwarded, the young journalist felt a faint tightening behind his eyes. It was not the length of the document that caught his attention, it was how little of it there was. The brief consisted of a single page, sparsely laid out, listing the names of 5 individuals who had all died prematurely. At first glance, the cases appeared unrelated. The deaths had occurred in different countries, years apart, and under markedly different circumstances. There was no shared profession, no shared nationality, no obvious overlap that would normally justify linking them together in a single article. Yet, his editor had done exactly that. The only common thread identified by his employer was a strange one. Every individual on the list had in some way been connected to the recovery, examination, or study of a set of ancient mummified human remains discovered on the Austro-Italian border. Over the next hour, the journalist began working methodically through each case. One by one, the details of the deaths drew his attention back to the same focal point: the frozen body of a prehistoric man recovered from high in the Alps. Each life on the list intersected briefly with that discovery, and then ended. As patterns began to form on his notepad, one name surfaced repeatedly. It belonged to a respected archaeologist and academic who had played a central role in the scientific study of the remains. The journalist circled it, paused, and then reached for the phone. It took several attempts before the call was answered. On the 5th try, a voice came through the receiver, thick with a German accent, identifying itself as Dr. Konrad Spindler. The journalist explained the reason for his call, outlining the apparent connection between the deaths and the ancient body. He asked carefully whether the doctor had any thoughts on the idea that these events might be linked. There was a brief silence on the line. Spindler eventually replied that, as a scientist, he did not believe in curses or supernatural explanations. He added, with a note of dry humour, that if such a curse did exist, then it would likely claim him next, and in that case, this conversation would likely be their last. The call ended shortly afterwards. Neither man could have known that Spindler would die only months later, or that his passing would be added to a growing list. Nor could the journalist have realised that the words now written on his notepad marked only the beginning of a story that would continue to unfold long after the ink had dried. The story we're exploring this week centres around the idea of a curse, something unseen yet powerful enough to affect the lives of those who encounter it. Whilst that concept may belong to folklore, the feeling behind it is far more familiar. Many of us experience periods where problems seem to build, where thoughts become overwhelming, and where it can feel as though something intangible is weighing heavily on our day-to-day lives. Taking the time to understand those patterns rather than trying to ignore them can make a meaningful difference. Speaking to someone removed from your immediate situation can offer a clearer perspective, helping you process what's happening and begin to move forward in a more grounded way. I've had times where things have stacked up to the point where it's difficult to see a way through, and simply talking it out has helped bring a bit of clarity and structure back into things. BetterHelp is a trusted paid partner that offers a straightforward way to begin that process. After completing a brief questionnaire, you'll be matched with a credentialed therapist suited to your needs, often within a couple of days. If at any point it doesn't feel like the right fit, you can switch therapists easily at no extra cost. More than 6 million people have used the platform to support their personal growth. If you're looking to better understand yourself or build healthier ways of managing what life throws at you, then you can find out more by clicking the link in the description or visiting betterhelp.com/bedtimestories to receive 10% off your first month of therapy. On the 19th of September 1991, two German tourists arrived at a police station in Innsbruck, Austria, with an unusual report. The couple, Helmut and Erika Iceman, explained that earlier that day they had been hiking in the high alpine region near the Ziemilaun mountain, close to the border between Austria and Italy, when they came across what appeared to be a human body embedded in ice. Given the location, their first assumption was that they had discovered the body of a climber who had died in a recent accident, an unfortunate but not unheard of occurrence in the Alps. However, as they approached, that assumption quickly began to unravel. The body did not resemble that of a modern mountaineer. There was no contemporary climbing equipment nearby, no synthetic clothing, and no visible signs of recent disturbance. Alarmed, the couple descended and contacted the authorities. Later that day, guided by the Icemans, a police officer and a local mountain ranger made the ascent to the site. Their initial inspection confirmed that a body was indeed present, but attempts to remove it were unsuccessful. The remains were firmly encased in the ice, and the tools available at the time were insufficient to free them without causing damage. Over the following 3 days, a more coordinated recovery effort was organised. Eventually, the body was extracted and transported to a nearby mortuary for examination. Several weeks later, preliminary findings were published by Konrad Spindler, an archaeologist based at the University of Innsbruck, who had been tasked with examining the body. Radiocarbon dating revealed that the remains were not decades old, but thousands of years old. The man had died approximately 5,000 years earlier, during the late Neolithic period. Spindler and his colleagues determined that the body belonged to an adult male, remarkably preserved by the alpine ice. He was later given the name Ötzi, derived from the Ötztal Alps where he had been found. Further analysis began to reveal details of his life, his health, and the circumstances of his death. Ötzi had been carrying a range of tools and equipment, including a copper axe, a flint dagger, and unfinished arrows, suggesting that he had been a hunter or traveller of some status within his community. Detailed examination revealed an arrowhead lodged deep in Ötzi's left shoulder. The wound showed no evidence of healing, indicating it had been sustained shortly before death. Blood traces from multiple individuals were also identified on his clothing and equipment, implying that he had been involved in a violent confrontation in the moments or hours leading up to his demise. As scientific papers detailing these findings began to circulate, two parallel developments also started to attract attention. The first was a prolonged and often bitter legal dispute over ownership of the body. Questions arose regarding whether Ötzi had been found on Austrian or Italian territory, leading to competing claims from regional authorities. The second, more unsettling development concerned a series of deaths linked, at least by association, to the discovery. In the years that followed, several individuals connected to Ötzi's recovery, study, or media documentation would die prematurely. Rainer Henn was a forensic pathologist based in Innsbruck and amongst the first specialists to be involved in examining the body recovered from the ice. He had travelled to the site alongside a broader party of scientists and officials tasked with overseeing the initial handling of the remains. In 1992, whilst engaged in a lecture tour discussing the discovery and his involvement in the examination, Henn was killed in a head-on traffic collision. He was 64 years old. Several months later, another member of the original recovery party also died. Kurt Fritz was a 52-year-old mountaineer with extensive experience in the Ötztal Alps. Fritz had been responsible for escorting Henn and other pathologists to the recovery site, guiding them across hazardous terrain and remaining present as efforts were made to extract the body from the ice. Not long after Henn's death, Fritz joined a small group of climbers on a routine ascent in the same mountain region. During the climb, the group was caught in an avalanche. When the avalanche subsided, the group assessed one another for injuries. Remarkably, none appeared to have been seriously harmed. All except one. Kurt Fritz had been struck directly by falling debris and was killed instantly. He was the only fatality. At this point, 2 deaths had occurred amongst individuals directly involved in the recovery of the body. Still, no formal connection was made. Accidents, after all, are an occupational risk in mountainous terrain. A year later, a 3rd death would begin to alter how the situation was perceived. Rainer Hultzel was a 47-year-old journalist who had been commissioned by police to document the recovery process. He spent 3 days in the mountains filming the extraction of the body and the surrounding efforts. With permission, he later used the footage to produce an hour-long documentary detailing the discovery and its significance. Only months after the documentary's premiere, Hultzel fell suddenly ill. Whilst out walking, he collapsed and was rushed to hospital. There, doctors diagnosed him with an aggressive brain tumour that had gone undetected until that point. Despite treatment, his condition deteriorated rapidly. He died within 3 weeks of the diagnosis. By now, 3 individuals linked by proximity to the same discovery had died prematurely. Still, it was only in retrospect that their deaths began to be grouped together. The turning point came with the death of a 4th individual, one whose association with the case was more visible and whose passing would draw international attention. It was at this stage that journalists began to refer to the growing list not as coincidence, but as something more unsettling, a pattern that would soon be given a name. What followed would transform a sequence of isolated tragedies into what the media would come to call the Iceman's Curse. In the months following the discovery on the Ziemilan Glacier, Helmut and Erika Ziemann assumed that their role in recovering the body would be formally recognized by the authorities. Under South Tyrolean law, any individual who discovers an artifact or object of historical significance is entitled to compensation amounting to 25% of its assessed value. Given the unprecedented nature of the find, the Ziemanns expected that the provision would apply in their case. What followed was a protracted and increasingly bitter dispute. Provincial officials informed the couple that whilst the body was unquestionably of immense scientific importance, it held no commercial value. As such, they were offered a payment of €5,000, described by the authorities as symbolic rather than compensatory. Unwilling to accept the decision, Helmut and Erika pursued legal action. The case soon became more complicated. 2 additional claimants came forward asserting that they, not the Ziemanns, had first encountered the body. According to their account, the German couple had merely been asked to photograph the remains. The competing narratives transformed what might have been a straightforward compensation claim into a lengthy legal battle involving multiple parties, conflicting testimonies, and disputed timelines. In November 2003, 12 years after the discovery, the court finally ruled in favour of Helmut and Erika Ziemann. The couple were awarded $300,000 in compensation, a sum that acknowledged their legal entitlement and appeared to bring the matter to a close. However, they would never receive it. In October 2004, Helmut Ziemann set out on a hiking trip in the same mountain range where he and his wife had made their discovery years earlier. He was 67 years old and an experienced climber, familiar with alpine conditions and cautious in his approach. When he failed to return home as planned, a large-scale search and rescue operation was launched. 8 days later, Helmut's body was found. He lay at the bottom of a 300-foot drop, partially buried in ice. The parallels were difficult to ignore. Like the Neolithic hunter he had discovered, Helmut Ziemann had come to rest frozen within the mountains. To some, the coincidence was unsettling. Within days of Helmut's recovery, another death was reported. Dieter Warnecke, the head of the local mountain rescue team who had helped locate Helmut's body, suffered a fatal heart attack. He was 45 years old and considered to be in good health. The proximity of the deaths, both in time and circumstance, drew immediate attention. The international media seized upon the growing list of deaths associated with the frozen remains. Headlines began referring openly to a curse, linking the deaths of those connected to Ötzi's recovery and study. Journalists tracked down surviving members of the research teams, asking whether they believed the ancient body carried some form of retribution. Amongst those approached was Dr. Konrad Spindler, the archaeologist who had led the initial analysis of the remains. Spindler dismissed the idea outright, describing the notion of a curse as superstition. He remarked that if such a curse was real, he would presumably be next. 4 months later, Spindler was dead. The 55-year-old scientist died from complications related to multiple sclerosis, a condition he had lived with for years. Whilst his death had a clear medical explanation, he had been managing the illness well, and its timing further fueled speculation. By this point, the pattern was firmly embedded in public consciousness. The list would grow again with the death of Tom Loy, an Australian biologist whose work had played a crucial role in reconstructing the events surrounding Ötzi's final moments. In 2002, Loy was found dead in his home in Brisbane. He was 63 years old. Officially, the deaths remained unconnected. Each had its own explanation: accidents, illness, coincidence. But whatever the causes, the shadow that formed around the discovery of Ötzi refused to fade. The idea that the dead might reach beyond the grave to punish the living is one that recurs across cultures, eras, and belief systems. It is a concept that sits uncomfortably between folklore and fear, dismissed by modern science, yet stubbornly persistent in the public imagination. Perhaps the most famous example emerged in November of 1922, when a British-led expedition uncovered the sealed tomb of the Egyptian pharaoh Tutankhamun in the Valley of the Kings. The discovery was heralded as one of the greatest archaeological achievements of the 20th century. Yet, within a decade, several members of the team who had entered the tomb or played key roles in its opening were dead. Lord Carnarvon, who financed the expedition, died only months after the tomb was breached, following a sudden illness triggered by an infected mosquito bite. Others followed, some under circumstances that appeared mundane, others less easily explained. The media quickly seized upon the idea of a curse. Ancient warnings, carved hieroglyphs, and whispered legends were woven into a narrative of supernatural retribution. The phrase, "the curse of the pharaohs," entered popular culture, becoming shorthand for the notion that some doors, once opened, exact a price. A similar pattern appeared half a century later in Poland. In the 1970s, archaeologists opened the tomb of King Casimir IV, a 15th century ruler whose burial chamber remained sealed for centuries. Soon after, a number of those involved in the excavation fell ill and died. The clustering of deaths once again prompted speculation that disturbing ancient remains carried consequences beyond the physical risks of excavation. In both cases, science eventually offered explanations. The tombs, long sealed and undisturbed, had become environments where molds, fungi, and bacteria could thrive. Those who entered without modern protective equipment inhaled spores that their immune systems could not effectively combat. Illness followed, sometimes rapidly, sometimes fatally. The curse, it seemed, was not supernatural at all, but biological. The case of Ötzi the Iceman, however, occupies a more ambiguous space. Unlike the sealed tombs of Egypt or Poland, Ötzi was not enclosed within a controlled environment for centuries. He lay exposed to ice and rock, subject to freeze and thaw, his body preserved not by deliberate burial, but by chance. There is no evidence that those who encountered him were exposed to a single shared pathogen. The deaths associated with his discovery did not follow a uniform pattern. Some were sudden accidents. Others were attributed to heart failure, neurological illness, or cancer. No single cause links them neatly together. And yet, the pattern remains difficult to ignore. Within a relatively short span of time, 13 years, a notable number of individuals connected to Ötzi's recovery, documentation or study died prematurely. They were not all elderly. They were not all unwell. They were not all exposed to the same conditions. The only clear commonality was their proximity at some point to the frozen remains of a man who himself had died violently more than 5,000 years earlier. This is where interpretation diverges. For those who reject the supernatural, the case represents an unfortunate convergence of unrelated events. In any sufficiently large group of people, spread across time and geography, some will die earlier than expected. When viewed retrospectively, patterns can emerge that feel meaningful but are ultimately coincidental. Human beings are adept at finding connections, even where none exist. For others, however, the case reinforces a very different belief. To them, Ötzi was not merely an archaeological specimen, but the victim of a violent act. A man hunted, wounded, and left to die in the mountains. His body remained untouched for millennia, his final moments preserved in silence. When that silence was broken, something was disturbed. Not a pathogen or a spore, but a history of violence abruptly pulled into the present. In the end, the case of Ötzi does not demand belief in curses. It does not require acceptance of supernatural punishment or conscious intent from the dead. What it does demand is an acknowledgement of how deeply unsettled we remain by the intrusion of the past into the present. We exhume bodies to learn from them, to catalogue them, to explain them. But occasionally, the past refuses to remain passive, and when it does, the question is not whether it reaches back, but whether it reaches forwards.